What is going on, everyone? Give It Thought back here today for another Final Fantasy 15 news update. And today I am asking the question, will Final Fantasy 15 get a sequel? And I don't mean a sequel in terms of Final Fantasy 16, I mean the type of sequel Final Fantasy 10 got with Final Fantasy 10-2, and likewise with Final Fantasy 13. So Final Fantasy 15's game director actually commented on this at Gamescom. But I'm going to save that comment for a second and look at the reception the sequels to the games have gotten in the past. And I'm doing this just to make a point later, so bear with me if this seems kind of off point. Now, Final Fantasy X actually holds a 92 Metacritic rating, which is very good. Most games would kill for that rating, and it's a great game. But this video is about Final Fantasy 15, so I'm not really going to go into my opinions on the game so much. But then its sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, got taken down a peg and got an 85, so we can start to see a pattern forming. So now let's move on to Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels. Final Fantasy XIII actually received an 83, which is a little bit lower than Final Fantasy X-2, but it's still a pretty good Metacritic rating. I've played games that I thought should have gotten way higher than that, and games that I thought were better than Final Fantasy XIII, so you have to respect that score. But then you move on to its sequel, Final Fantasy XIII-2, and it got a 79. So as with Final Fantasy X, you see the pattern of a downward slope. But then you move on to its third sequel, Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns, and it got a 66. That's pretty bad. So now that we have the aforementioned pattern down of the scores getting lower every time a sequel comes out, let's get to that comment Hajime Tabata, Final Fantasy XV's game director, made at Gamescom. And I quote, "To answer the question of whether we have any intention of making further games with Noctis in them after or continuing the story after Final Fantasy 15 is out, I can tell you we don't currently have any plans for that." So according to Tabata, there are no plans for a Final Fantasy 15 sequel. And I think that's because Final Fantasy 15 looks to wrap up the story of Noctis and his royalty. And I also think the DLC has something to do with that. There are a lot of DLC plans for this game, which you can see in a past video I made, and I think those look to tie up any loose ends with all of the characters in the game, because they have announced that the DLC will focus on the secondary characters and not Noctis. But I guess since they are not focusing on Noctis, that does leave the opportunity for a sequel to the game, but they aren't planning it right now. I know what a lot of you are thinking, and that is that the sequels to the past games were just cash grabs, and you may be right in some sense, because Tabata has commented on that as well. Quoting him once more, "There may be a call for it business-wise," by it he means the sequel. "But personally, from our point of view, the way we see it is there are people that have been waiting for this game for a very long time now, and we want them to keep enjoying it for as long as possible." So you can see in that statement that Tabata is kind of misdirecting to keep the focus off of Square Enix, and forcing the journalist not to ask the question if money has influenced past sequels, so it looks like it may have. But nonetheless, this statement leads further opportunity for a sequel. And on the money side of things, it is obvious that this game will make money. It's a Final Fantasy game. Although how that factors into over a decade of development is beyond me, I still do think the game will make money. It just seems obvious to me. So that does lend to the executives at Square Enix wanting a sequel for this game, just like the others. And the money point also factors into the fact that Square Enix and Tabata's team created an entirely new engine for this game, and Square Enix would want to capitalize on that as much as possible. But I don't think Tabata is on board with that point either. In another statement, he said, "We want to use the technological foundation that we've built up with Final Fantasy 15 and move on to do something completely new using that know-how and that base. We're going to look into new directions with it." So obviously the team under Tabata wants to look into a new game, and he doesn't want to make a sequel. I think he feels like the story is wrapped up within Final Fantasy 15, but Square Enix could force him into making a sequel for the game that he doesn't want to do. And that's where we go back to the pattern. As we've seen with Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XIII, the sequels don't hold water when compared to the original games. So I think if there is a sequel to Final Fantasy 15, it will not be nearly as good as the base game. And that is entirely obvious to me when looking at the downward slope of a pattern that is concerned with the previous games and their sequels. But I'm just a YouTuber looking for patterns where there may not be any. So I want to know what you guys think. Do you think there's going to be a sequel? And if there is, what do you think about the quality of it? Just let me know down in the comments. And with that, I think that's where I'm going to end today's video. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out the video I mentioned earlier in this one, where I talk about whether or not Final Fantasy 15 already has too many DLC plans. Just click the video annotation to go right there. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Once you do that, you'll be up to date with all the news on Final Fantasy 15, and subsequently No Man's Sky if you enjoyed that game as well. So I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, give thought to everything.